Hi everyone, I'm recording this podcast just to cover understanding of a few different terms used on the D300 survey track. Now things get really confusing with this, and I do see it from a learner perspective. There's so many different terms and ideas that all seem to get quite muddled up together, and I'm sure the materials and we as tutors can use these terms interchangeably, which can feel confusing as well. So I thought I'd just record a podcast that really kind of just links together, what we mean by some of these terms, and also hopefully kind of knocks on the head a bit a couple of adjacent issues. So you're designing these projects and you're either using multiple regression, looking at the relationship in a kind of correlational sense between these variables, or you're using principal components analysis, which is really about sort of developing a scale or testing an existing scale to look at the factor structure. Now, I'll be honest, almost no one uses principal components analysis for D300. If you do, fantastic, and I will support your understanding through that. Most people, like 98% of D300 students in the last 8 years of doing the module, have done multiple regression. And I think that's partly because multiple regression is sort of what makes the most intuitive sense to what you have in mind going into the project and as you develop your understanding of what you want to focus on. Multiple regression is great because you can focus on predicting a defined dependent variable, or DV, using a set of predictor variables or independent variables, or IVs. And by definition, it's a multiple regression, so be using two or more of these predictors. And that links up to the kind of project that most of you will have in mind and that most of you are probably going to be doing for your D300 survey projects. Let's take a step back though and think about what these terms mean. So we've got this term, we've got different terms, haven't we? Psychological constructs, variables, measures, scales, and kind of question surveys. Now they all get a bit muddled up, and I'm going to try and talk about them in a way which will hopefully make them feel clearer. The starting one here, I think, is this idea of psychological constructs. So when I want to measure something, first of all, I have an idea about the thing I want to measure, and these things can become so kind of etched into our heads that they can feel almost real. But remember, all of these ideas, they're just ideas. They're ideas about personality. They're ideas about how we measure attitudes or beliefs about something. They're ideas about, some sort of trait or habit we have that we're going to measure. They're all linked to theories. They're all linked to, tons of, evidence and, plenty of theoretical discussion and all that kind of thing in most cases. So the idea starts with psychological constructs. So extroversion is a good example. It's a psychological construct. There's no bit of our brain that, is to do with extroversion. I mean, there is evidence looking at kind of neurological and kind of neuroscience pathways linked to that, but it's all fairly sketchy. There's no extroversion bit of our brains. There's no impulsivity kind of bit of our brains in really hard to find terms. So what we're doing with these is we are thinking about something that we can meaningfully understand people to vary on. It doesn't mean these are perfect ideas, but they are ideas that start us to think about individual differences, how we all differ from each other on something like how extroverted or introverted we are. The psychological constructs are the starting point then. They're the idea of the thing we're interested in measuring. They probably link to theory, they probably link to an evidence base supporting that theory, but they are psychological constructs. They are constructed ideas from researchers, practitioners, whoever it may be that came up with the ideas or that is in the business of using the ideas in the currency of their work. Okay, so psychological constructs. So what do we do as psychologists? We measure these constructs, don't we? And we measure them using probably something like a psychological scale. Now, most scales, use Likert type items. So strongly disagree, strongly agree. They use statements and responses to those, like type responses, scoring from maybe 1 for strongly disagree through to maybe 5 for strongly agree, to a statement like I am the life and soul of the party. If that sums up who I am and I strongly agree with that, I might put down 5 for that. I strongly agree with that statement. That suggests that I'm someone who's relatively more extroverted. So we have psychological scales. We also have kind of looser language, which I'd say is something like measures. So if we have a measure of age, which might just be a free text box, by the way, saying please type your age in the box below. That would be an example of a psychological measure, I'd say, or a demographic measure, I guess, to be more exact. So we've got psychological constructs, then we've got measures and scales. We put these scales or measures on questionnaires, on surveys, don't we? And questionnaires and surveys are talked about in different ways in D300. I suppose really surveys refers to the broader methodology being used here, the data collection methods being used. And questionnaires is the set of scales we can think about sending out at any given time via a survey data collection kind of mechanism. So we've got psychological constructs that we are measuring using measures and scales, that we are kind of housing, embedding into questionnaires, which is one way of thinking about a survey data collection method. When we've collected our data, and Qualtrics is a fantastic thing to use, you don't have to worry about it yet, but you'll come on to putting your ethically approved questionnaires onto Qualtrics, which is freely available to you as an OU student, and you'll have plenty of time going through what's involved in using Qualtrics. You'll send it out to your people you hope will complete your survey. Once you've got all the responses in you need around 100, you will download an SPSS dataset. It's very, very straightforward. You'll download it straight from the Qualtrics website as an SPSS file. It needs a bit of tidying up and organising, but it really is so much more straightforward than entering your own data via a paper questionnaire, for example. When you download it, you're going to be looking at your different responses, and you're going to be creating mean variables for each of your scales. So when it comes to thinking about your actual research question, you're not thinking about scales anymore. You're thinking about the variables that represent those psychological constructs you were interested in. So a project looking at the relationship between resilience, extroversion, and recent well-being. You'll have a scale for each of those psychological constructs, but the thing that you will have ultimately is something that's more like a variable. So you'll create a mean scale based on perhaps the 10 extroversion items. You'll aggregate them together. You'll have an average mean extroversion item in your SPSS dataset, and that will be the variable that you were always interested in having it ultimately, that you include in your multiple regression. Why do you have 10 extroversion items and not 1? Well, that's to do with construct validity. You want a range of different ways of getting at that thing you're interested in, this psychological construct called extroversion. You don't want to just say, are you an extroverted person, yes or no? You want to be more inventive. You want to be more clever and come at it from a number of different angles, a number of different kind of facets of that psychological construct called extroversion. That's why we have these different items. But when it comes down to it, you want a single extroversion item, the average extrovertedness of that individual participant, and then the average extroversion of all of the participants in your entire sample. So that's what you're looking at when you've got your final variable. You'll have a mean extroversion for your sample because everything's operating at that sample level by then. So I hope that's unpacked some of those terms a bit. Let's label them again. Psychological constructs. Those are the theories, the ideas. We measure them with measures and scales, psychometric scales. We send out those measures and scales using surveys, questionnaires, and ultimately we get variables, which are kind of mean, average versions of each of those psychological constructs. And when we're preparing the research question for your project, I guess we're talking in terms of variables a lot of the time, because that's the key starting point. That's the research question. What's the relationship between resilience, extroversion, and recent well-being? That's what you're interested in knowing. Okay, just to come back to something linked to all this, and we've talked about the idea of the relationship between this variable, that variable, and the other variable. What does that word relationship key us into? Well, it keys us into this idea that it's a correlational design, okay? We talk about the survey methods track of D300, but we could also talk about this as the correlational methods track of D300. You're all doing correlational studies, whether, by the way, you're doing multiple regression or principal components analysis. You're looking at relationships, you're looking at links, you're looking at associations between variables. And because you're doing correlational research, that's why it's really important you don't have any words in your research question or research title or anywhere in your project that talk about the impact of, this variable on that variable, the effect of this variable on that variable. Because that suggests cause-effect relationships, okay? So you're not talking about the effect of resilience on extroversion. You're not talking about the impact of extroversion on recent well-being. You're talking about the relationship between these variables. It's something looser, it's something less certain. But it's important to get that phrasing right and to consistently use that phrasing in all of your materials for D300. Because if you don't, and you slip into that language of impact, of effect on one variable and on another, you're giving your reader and you're giving your marker the suggestion that you don't understand what kind of design this project is. It's a correlational study design for the survey track. It's not an experimental design where you'd be looking at cause-effect relationships. So it's a subtle point, but it's an important one. Okay. We've talked a bit about measures and scales in this podcast, and one thing there that's come up persistently is about permissions to use scales. Now, I think D300 suggests to err on the side of caution here, to potentially request permissions on some occasions. My main guidance here, and I want to be as consistent as I possibly can with everything else you'll have heard, is that you probably don't, in most cases, need to request permissions from authors to use their scales. Why is that? The main answer is you're not using these scales for commercial purposes. You're not using these scales for some sort of marketing research on a massive scale using enormous batteries of measures and psychometric tools. You're using small scales, you're using publicly available scales, you're using scales for an undergraduate psychology project, you're using scales that you're sending out to friends, family, social networks. You're not using these for personal gain in a financial or a kind of material sense, really. And for that reason, you don't need to be seeking author permissions. It's fine to use the scales that you find out there in the literature. And this is part of the reason that we're encouraging you to have smaller numbers of scales and scales with small numbers of items. So we're suggesting that you go for around, questionnaires of around 30, 35, 40 at top kind of items, so that you're not using those enormous kind of batteries of scale items, which would be more kind of problematic from a kind of copyright point of view. Okay, but as a rule, people won't require permissions to use scales for their D300 projects. Okay, I think that's it on this podcast about scales, measures, psychological constructs and variables. Please get back to me with any questions that have come up from listening to this podcast, and I hope this has been useful. I hope you can use what we talked about here and plug this into your ongoing D300 work, which is of course very much focused around your psychological projects.